So this is the story of Samuel, and by story we don't mean story like Little Red Riding Hood, like it's not true. It's true, but it is. This book is very much. You've got characters, you've got a storyline, you've got times when they're trying to do something and then things seem not to work out. If you think of an action movie or a novel, you've got your characters are trying to work towards some goal, whether it's destroying the One Ring or whether it's rescuing somebody or whether it's finding out who done it, who murdered so and so. They're trying to get to this goal, and it's not a straight line. It's more of a zigzag because there's problems, there's twists and turns in the story as you go. And this book is very much like that. I call it a book, and you might be a bit confused because isn't it two, 1st and 2nd Samuel? But in the original Hebrew, this is actually only one book. And so I'm going to call it the Book of Samuel because that's actually more accurate. We've gotten used to, in our translations, the book is broken. But if you read as far as the end of 1 Samuel and then you go on to something else, you haven't finished the story yet. It's not over. So you should really keep on reading right into 2 Samuel. In fact, in some ways, can you close that door, please, so the wind doesn't blow us all? In fact, if let's say this is 1 Samuel, so chapter 1 and then chapter 20, I forget what chapter number it ends on, but and then 2 Samuel, there's actually, in terms of the sort of like some of the dominant storylines, there's actually a major transition in the storyline about here. In other words, you have to go a couple chapters in to second Samuel. So if we were to break the book into like a part 1, part 2, we would do it a couple chapters into 2 Samuel, not actually where it is right now. Incidentally, it's the same deal with the books of Kings and Chronicles. In Hebrew, each of those is actually only one book, and there's one of them, I forget which it is now, that the book break is actually like I want to say it's like in the middle of a paragraph. comes at a bad spot. So just one book of Samuel. So we're going to try to talk about, and not necessarily certainly not chapter by chapter. We're going to go like big idea here, and also a little bit topical, but with the goal of giving you some ideas of how to read through this book and kind of track with the storyline and kind of appreciate how the author does things, how the author presents things. The Bible is very dramatic, and this book is certainly like that. A couple of you were in my Story of the Old Testament session. Samuel is one of the high points in the story of the Bible. There's a lot that happens in the book by way of turning points in the unfolding of the story. And so this is not a book that treads water or fills out in more detail or gives you important sort of side information or supplementary information. These are some of the turning points, some of the like, if the Bible is a movie and you step out to get a snack while Samuel is on, and then you come back, you're going to be like, what? What's going on? Because you're going to miss some of the big turning points in it. It's a hard book to summarize because so much happens and there are so many characters. We think of David and Goliath, but you start adding to that Saul, Hannah, Samuel. What about Eli and his 2 sons? They're kind of interesting characters. What about Joab? What are we supposed to think about? Joab's the guy who sticks his knife in people's gut and multiple times, very graphically kills people. Actually, Samuel is possibly the most graphic book of the Bible Its competitor would probably be Kings. I think there's reasons for that, but Samuel is one of the most graphic books of the Bible. Joab, Abishai, Abner, then you've got people like Ahithophel, the king's counselor, who betrays him. You've got Hushai, the king's friend, who pretends to be on David's enemy side, but really he's passing along this information, trying to help David by being sort of a mole within the enemy network. You've got just this huge range of characters, and it's not really the way the characters are presented in this book is not one after another. So it's not so much like first we have Saul, then we have David, then we have Joab or something like that. But we're introduced to Saul, and his life is kind of like this, and then David's life is kind of like this. But then like Joab kind of comes in there, and then we don't see him for a while, and then he comes in, and then he comes and goes from the story. So there's this like interweaving of characters come and go. But to try to summarize what this book is about, something like this: the story of David and of God's redemptive plan being worked out through David and in spite of David. In terms of, if we were going to do the whole book of Samuel with tick marks for the various chapters, obviously that's not to scale or not the right number of chapters, but how many of them involve David? It's roughly like that amount. So the only thing that's really counterintuitive about making David the main character of this, in some ways God is the main character, and when we talk about the whole Bible, who is the main character? It would be God, because God is the only character who's there the entire time, and everything revolves around him. But David, the surprising thing is about David being the main character is he's not there in the first several chapters. However, there is a lot of anticipation of him. We'll see momentarily a reference to the king in at kind of the end of the first story, as it were, within the story of Samuel, the first incident. And then you have a search for a king, and the way it's going to go is sort of a false lead. As the nation starts out into kingship, it's going to start off with Saul, but that's not going to go well. And the whole thing is leading towards David is really the one to be king. And then he's going to dominate the story up until the end. One technique as you are looking at a book of the Bible and trying to understand its flow, its thoughts, progression. One way is things like this of using, chapter divisions are not original to the text. It's a later thing, but using them as a rough metric. What is each chapter about? What does it talk about? Think and asking yourself that question, think paragraphs. The verse divisions that our Bible's been divided into for reference are extremely helpful, because we can say, now turn in your Bibles to James chapter 3 and verse 14, and we don't have to say, now turn to the portion that says, who among you is wise and discerning. That's in the Jewish Jewish literature. I've read Jewish stuff from like the Middle Ages, and they'll say, now in the passage about, or in the passage that says, now there was a famine in the land, or something like that. And that's their way of citing scripture. So the verses are extremely helpful for reference, but there's some downsides. And one is we get so focused on verses that we can miss the forest for the trees. In studying the Bible, one of the most important things, not just for Samuel, but the whole Bible is think paragraphs. start to look at paragraphs of text and think, what is this paragraph about? And yes, there's certainly, every word of Scripture matters, and there's certainly times to drill down into individual words, but not at the expense of not seeing the forest for the trees. To think paragraphs and think, what is this paragraph about? What is this paragraph about? And what's the connection? Why this following this? So, you go through, you chunk out a book and you think, what's this one about? Or like, who are some of the main characters? Who are some of them, if you're reading an epistle, what are some of the main topics that come up in this letter? And so, like, for example, in the New Testament, if you go through the epistles in the New Testament and you think, what are some of the main things that are talked about? One example is the law. The law comes up a lot. It's not it's not really a side issue. It's a big issue in the New Testament. And there's a couple of books in the New Testament that are largely devoted to that topic, like Galatians, Hebrews, Romans. In terms of a book like Samuel or books like Kings, you think characters. And so what characters appear in these chapters? So that's one thing, is to kind of look like roughly chapter by chapter, some of the big topics, people. Another thing you can do is bookends. Is how does a book start and how does it end? As far as how it starts, it's not necessarily the first words, the first sentence or two. It can be, but it can be the first major story or unit of a book. Let me give you an example from the New Testament. The book of Matthew, in the first, not the first words, but the first major story is the first major. You got the genealogy and the birth of Christ, and the passage is cited, calls his name Emmanuel, which is Hebrew for God with us. And so the first major segment of Matthew is the coming of Christ, right? The birth of Christ. In there, calls him Emmanuel for, Emmanuel means God with us. And then the last verse of the book, lo, I'm with you always, even to the end of the age. I am with you. Jesus says, I am with you always. Wow. So God is with us right at the beginning of Matthew. Mm-hmm. And then the very last verse, Jesus says, I am with you always. So a bookending that God is with us there in Matthew. So here in Samuel, the first story is Hannah and the conception birth of Samuel. So she's barren and so on, and then she prays, and God grants her the request, and she gives birth to Samuel, whom she dedicates to the temple to serve there. In 1 Samuel chapter 2 and chapter 2, the first 10 verses, in verse 11, the first 11 verses of chapter 2 really are the conclusion to chapter 1, wrap up the story. And verses 1 through 10 of chapter 2 are Hannah's song of thanksgiving for what God has done in this. And at the end of this song, in verse 10, she says, for those who contend with the Lord will be shattered. Against them he will thunder in the heavens. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. So she's looking forward to one day when not only was she personally vindicated, but God is going to settle accounts with all the earth and be a judge over all the earth. And then she says this, and he will give strength to his king and will exalt the horn of his anointed. Anointed in Hebrew is to pronounce it in an English way, Messiah. And the way to say Messiah, to communicate the same meaning, anointed, the way to say anointed one in Greek is Christ. Again, saying it in an English accent, is Christ. So Messiah, Christ, one is the Hebrew word, one is the Greek word, and they mean anointed one. Now, as Hannah speaks, they have no king. This is the days of the judges, or Samuel's the last of the judges. So they have no king, but she either is, maybe either the Holy Spirit gives her this idea, or she's remembering in the law, in the Pentateuch, it actually speaks of one day there will be a king. And she's looking forward to that day when there will be a king one day. God gives strength to his king and will exalt the horn of his anointed. Now, the very end of the book, I'm not turning there, but summarize, the way the book ends is David foolishly orders a census. And it seems to be a reflection of pride, that he's not looking to the Lord for strength. And God accordingly sends a plague on the people. So an angel of death is going through the land, and it comes to Jerusalem, and David actually sees it, and he runs to a threshing floor and stands between the angel of death and the people. And he purchases this threshing floor, and the guy who owns it says, you're the king, I'll give it to you. And David says, no, I'm not going to offer sacrifice that costs me nothing. So he apparently personally pays for this land, this piece of land in Jerusalem, and offers a sacrifice, and the angel of death stops there. David is obviously the king at that point, and he has he's interposed himself between the angel of death and the people, offers a sacrifice on a piece of land where the temple will be built a few decades from then. And that the threshing floor of Urana, that's where the temple is going to be built. So the book starts off on this note of, obviously Samuel is going to be a major character in the story, but in this note, it strikes this note of there's going to be a king, and God is going to work through a king in some way that connects where God is going to judge the whole world, where God is going to make all things new, put all things right for all the world, and there's going to be a king. God's going to have a king, an anointed one. And so we kind of start the book with that thought in our minds, and that recedes into the background as we go further into chapter 2 and so on. And yet that note has been sounded in a last question. Raise your hands. Have you seen the new word, the new Chronicles of Narnia Dawn Treader movie? Not the one that was done like forever ago with like the costumes, but the one with CG and so on.
Yeah.
Do you remember the scene where there's the pond where things turn into gold? Put the things that turn into gold, and then Caspian and Edmund cross swords and fight there. In that movie, I thought overall it was a good movie, but I felt like it was a little like they hadn't prepared for it. And so Edmund and Caspian fighting there just seemed implausible. And it's just, so I don't know if you guys had the same reaction, and maybe it's been a while since you've seen the movie, so it's a vague memory, but I watched it recently, and so it's like, it seems kind of implausible. It's like, would they really do that? And when you have a story, whether it's a book or whether it's a movie, there's something called motivation. There needs to be like either motivation or foreshadowing. Before there's a major event, you drop a hint about it. You don't just like out of nowhere this giant thing. You drop hints along the way. And so like I'll use a Lord of the Rings example because I know we have at least one or two Lord of the Rings fans here. That when Frodo at Mount Doom puts the ring on his finger, if that had just like come out of nowhere, it'd be like, what? Frodo, Frodo's not like that. But all along the way, we've gotten hints that the ring is like playing on Frodo's mind. And so, because there's foreshadowing, we get these little hints leading up to that. We then are prepared to believe it when it happens. So in a good story, there's going to be hints dropped along the way. So here we have planted in our minds the idea God's going to bring a king, and this king somehow is going to be involved in making things right in the final day. And then the way the book ends is with a king, and it's not the king, but with a king standing between the consequences of sin and those who deserve those consequences. And he purchases land where we find out the temple is going to be built. And does the temple have real significance for God's plan of redemption? Yes, it does. So the way this book starts and ends is very much redemption and kingship. But these things are in some way tied. And as we read this book, if we were to sort of forget what we know, what comes later, if we started in Genesis and we were just reading through, would we understand that the way this is going to work out is that the king is going to die on behalf of the sin of those who deserve it. And that's how the king is going to stand between death and those who deserve it. Let's do a little bit with working. That's really big picture, front and end of the book. As we plow into the book, we have this guy Samuel. Is his unusual coming into the world is kind of how the book gets rolling. But then we have in 2:12, now the sons of Eli were worthless men. They did not know the Lord. And it goes on to describe their behavior is thoroughly wicked. And not only is their behavior thoroughly wicked, but their father, who should be seeing to it that the tabernacle is respected as to its holiness, since it represents God and so on, he won't confront his sons about it. And eventually, when Eli is confronted by a prophet, he kind of half-heartedly tells his sons, you really shouldn't be doing this stuff. But it just goes right over their heads, because if he had really cared about this or been willing to deal with it, he would have dealt with it long ago. And so when we get to like chapter 2, verse 11, things seem to be going swimmingly. Hannah's had the baby that she longed for, Samuel. He's dedicated to the service of God at the temple. Hannah has other sons, other children, so it's not as though she gave up her hope. She was willing to, but God gave her other children, and so God has rewarded that act of service. Things are going great, except now as Samuel is growing up, who's he growing up around in the sanctuary, in the tabernacle? Around quite miserable, ungodly characters. And as things go along, when Samuel is called by God, the Sunday school story this is a favorite in Sunday school classes. Samuel, Samuel, and he thinks Eli is calling him, and so runs and so on. Well, do you know what it was that God wanted to tell him? He says, "Tell Eli that judgment is coming on his house, and there will never again be an old man in this house, because everyone's going to die young." And it's quite a stern message.
First assignment.
His first assignment, yeah, it's one of doom of hey boss, guess what? Your kids are gonna die, and your whole family is gonna, and your line is gonna cease being priests to God one day, and that is what's going to happen through the book. And actually, it's not until the book of Kings that this is fully fulfilled, but the outworking of this prophecy begins gradually going through the book. But meanwhile, we have this impending doom on Eli and his family. But then we have statements like the end of 1 Samuel 2:21, and the boy Samuel grew before the Lord. And then verse 26, chapter 2, now the boy Samuel was growing in stature and in favor with both the Lord and with men. And so we have sort of an X shape in the first, the first, was it 10? The first 7 chapters of 1 Samuel are sort of an X shape. And I'm going to call it a little x because we'll see a big X in a minute. The rise of Samuel and the fall of Eli. The first 7 chapters are the rise of Samuel, and at the same time the decline and fall of the house of Eli. And these things they're intertwined in how they're presented. The climax is the Battle of Shiloh, where his wicked 2 sons, Hophni and Phinehas, are killed in battle. The Ark of the Covenant is lost. They had thought that it was sort of a magic formula for success. And when Eli, who's very old and blind, he's setting up on an elevated place, and when he hears the news, he falls off his chair and lands on his neck and dies. And then Samuel goes on to be the last judge of Israel. And so the rise of Samuel and the fall, or the rise of Samuel and the fall of Eli at the same time, is a little X. Then the rest, basically the rest of 1 Samuel and going a few chapters into, in some ways going a couple chapters into 2 Samuel, is what I'll call a big X. It takes a lot more space, and it's much more central to the whole book. And this is the rise of David and the fall of Saul. And that bigger X is going to go through, again, basically the rest of 1 Samuel. The rise of David and the fall of Saul. Initially, we have only Saul presented. And when the people ask for a king, it's not technically wrong that they're asking for a king, because God had actually promised a king all along. There's a prophecy in Genesis, and then there's provision made in the law. And it was God's intent all along for there to be a king. The problem was why and when. The reason they asked for a king is not because God, we've been reading our Pentateuchs and we see that it says about a king here and we don't have one. They want a king because everybody else has got one. All the pagan nations around, everybody else has got a king. Why can't we have one? So the motivation is wrong, and then the timing is wrong. Sometimes God's timing is not our timing. Like when Paul wanted a ministry in the province of Asia, God said no, and led him to Philippi and elsewhere. And later, God did bring him to the province of Asia, and he had a very fruitful ministry there, particularly in the city of Ephesus. He was there 3 years and had a very tremendous ministry there. But timing, and Paul did listen to God's timing, but the people of Israel didn't. It was not the right time, and it was not the right reason for it. And so Saul becomes king, but pretty much from the get-go, there's trouble. It's here's one thing as you read the Old Testament is look for the way that characters are introduced. Sometimes it's the way they're described initially. Sometimes it's the first thing that they say is indicative. So 2 examples from outside Samuel. One would be Laban. First time we meet Laban is before he becomes a major character, but he comes on the scene because he's Rebekah's brother, and as Rebekah is being found for a wife for Isaac, he runs out, and the servant, in order to show Abraham's sincerity, had given Rebekah jewelry, including nose rings, and not everyone in these parts is real excited about that, but that's the way it was. Probably not a piercing, and one of those that just kind of hooks around, but jewelry to show Abraham's sincerity. Laban runs out to see what's going on, and it says he looked and he saw the jewelry, or something to that effect. And so you can sort of picture like a cartoon and the little like thought bubble coming up and $. Like money. And what's Laban going to be like when he becomes a major character later in Genesis, when his nephew Jacob's working for him?
Worldly wise.
Yeah, worldly wise and money. He's in it for the money. And so the first time we meet Laban is like money bags. Boaz, on the other hand, the first time we meet Boaz, or the first time he says anything, he's walking out in the fields and he says something to the effect of "God bless you," as he's going among his servants. He could have said, "Work harder." What are you looking at? I didn't say it was break time, but he's saying, "God bless you," and that's the kind of man he is. He's a very God-centered man, a very merciful man. So the way people are characterized, how is Saul characterized when we meet him? He is characterized as being tall. He's head and shoulders above all the other Israelites. He's tall. Is that good or bad? In the Bible, is that good or bad? It's a bad thing. Nowhere in Scripture is it ever a good thing for somebody to be tall, because so we can laugh a little bit about Scott. We can joke with Scott about this, but why is this a bad thing? It's because the giants like Goliath, Goliath is like the living incarnation of worldly power and might. He's tall and strong. He's been a warrior from his youth, and he's got this armor and these weapons. And the giants in the land that the Israelites get scared of and decide to keep wandering in the desert or go back to Egypt where they were slaves instead of going in and conquering. Being tall in the Bible is a sign of the world's power and might. And so when Saul is presented as being tall, we should be going and thinking back to some of the wilderness wanderings, and they're encountering giants and so on, and being scared of them. And when God says, "No, when you encounter people who are bigger and taller, don't be scared." And so now Saul is tall. It's a little bit like, it gives you a little bit of a funny feeling. And then there's some really interesting things as far as, and I don't know what all to make all of it, but he's the king in the Old Testament times is often presented as a shepherd. And here he is looking for 2 donkeys, which are not like cats that are small and hide very well. And it's like, don't you think he could keep track of some donkeys? But he can't find them anywhere. And is that a foreshadowing of when he's king, he's not going to be competent? That said, things do seem to start out okay, sort of, when his rule starts.
So Samuel is the writer?
Samuel's probably not the writer.
Not the writer.
Because he dies partway through.
But the writer wrote from the perspective, from the preferred perspective of the people. We want somebody that's tall, I think.
I think that his highlighting that Saul was tall is supposed to put some foreboding in our minds.
Not necessarily that he thought that was great, but maybe I'm overthinking it.
So the narrator, the author of the book of Samuel, the narrator, he points that out so that the seed is planted as our mind. Like maybe this Saul is not quite who we're looking for. So we have that like seed of doubt planted in our mind, and that way it's not like completely out of nowhere. when Saul fails later. It's sort of like we had an idea all along.
Mm-hmm.
You know, in a good story, you prep. You know,
Mm-hmm.
you drop hints along the way. You work towards that. Now, you know, some things initially Saul does okay at, but he's not exactly. There's some warning signs early on, and then comes chapters 13 and 15. That whole section is really setting up for the downfall of Saul, because in chapter 14 as well, in 13, Saul is given a job to do and doesn't do it. And then when confronted, he makes excuses and he fudges with things. In chapter 14, there's a battle, and Jonathan, Saul's son, is, along with his armor bearer, the only one brave enough to take on the Philistines, even though God promised that if they trust him, they would have success in the land. In chapter 15, that's where things really come to a head. God tells Saul, it's time for judgment on the Amalekites, and you are going to be my instrument of judgment on the Amalekite people. Your job is to annihilate all of them. Is that genocide? Yes, but it's God who's doing it, and God is in charge, and God is always just. And so God is not doing something bad. This was not the Israelites' idea to wipe the Amalekites out. It's God's idea. But God is using the Israelites to do this. So he tells Saul to destroy the Amalekites completely. But Saul doesn't do it. He does not completely destroy them. And then when he's confronted about it by Samuel, he makes excuses. And then Samuel says, God is taking the kingdom from you. And he turns to leave, and Saul grabs onto his cloak and tears it. And Samuel says, as you've torn this cloak, the kingdom is being torn from you. So now there is a search for a new king, and God sends Samuel to anoint David, and we know that story pretty well. There's one thing about it that could be a bit puzzling, and I want to raise this question and then hopefully come back to it later. Although there's a lot of emphasis in the text on man looks at the outward appearance, God looks on the heart. When they do find David, it does remark he is handsome. And that's a bit puzzling, isn't it? He's handsome. It remarks that there in that chapter 16. But we'll come back to that. Like, why would that come up? Then in chapter 17 is David and Goliath. And here's Saul, the king, and he's head and shoulders above any Israelite. He's the tallest one. But then comes this giant. And the tallest Israelite is not brave enough to fight this pagan giant. But when David comes, and he's just coming there to help out his brothers and make sure that they've got enough food and so on, and he finds out what's going on, and that Goliath, and here's the thing, Goliath is mocking God, because the armies of Israel are God's representative in this land and really in the earth. Israel is God's representative on earth. And so by mocking the armies of Israel, Goliath is mocking God. And David says, this can't be. And why is no one, dealing with this? And then he says, well, I'll deal with this, because it's God's name that's at stake. And so this is David's attitude. He's not in it for himself. He's in it for God's fame, God's reputation. And so David takes this step of faith and deals with Goliath. And this begins, chapter 16, David's anointing, and then his defeat of Goliath begins the rise of David and the fall of Saul. And as we go through the book, these things are, again, it's interwoven. It's not all one and then all the other. It's interwoven is David's rise to the kingship and Saul's fall from kingship. And now, as we're saying before, there's roadblocks, there's twists and turns in the plot, and so David almost gets killed more times than we can even count. And he's supposed to be king, but he's running in the wilderness and so on. In looking at this as a story, again, not that it's not true, but that the Bible's not an encyclopedia where we look under D for David and S for Saul and, whatever, but or that, and a lot of times the conclusions we're supposed to get, the applications we're supposed to get, are not spelled out for us in books like this. In books like Ephesians, it pretty much tells you do this, don't do this. In books like this, it's much more, we have to think about it. But this is the way God designed it, as like a story, and we got to ingest it, we got to dwell on it. So in a story, there's something called a foil, which is like where you have like Beauty and the Beast. How many know Beauty and the Beast? Gaston and La Fool, is that his name? Gaston is giant and muscular and good at what he does, and then La Fool is tiny and like flabby and he's just incompetent. But they're buddies somehow. I don't know why they're buddies, but the reason they're buddies is that La Fool is a foil for Gaston, because he accentuates everything about Gaston that's mighty and powerful, because right next to him is this bumbling, flabby, and so this contrast.
Andy Griffith and Barney Fife, maybe similarly.
Yeah, right. So, and it doesn't have to be like bumbling, and it can be any two sort of opposite or different approaches, like Luke Skywalker, Darth Vader. Darth Vader cuts off Luke's hand, and so on. And then, and he's in it for the dark side or whatever he's in it for. But then at the end, at the end of the original trilogy, I should say, Luke cuts off Darth Vader's hand. And when he sees that, he thinks, I don't want to be another Darth Vader. And then he I don't know if he shuts his sword thing down or what, but he says, I'm not going to fight, because I'm not here to kill people. I'm not here to destroy you per se. So there's that contrast between like Vader's response to victory and Luke's response to victory are different things. Like Luke has it in his power to destroy Darth Vader, and he doesn't, because he wants to be a different person. So Saul and David, throughout the book, they're presented as contrasts. The way they treat their enemies, Saul finds perceived enemies in the priests at Nob, who helped David, and they didn't even know that there was any trouble, and so they're just completely innocent. But they helped David, and Saul says, "Well, you helped my enemy. I'm going to kill all of you." And he has a Gentile kill them. The Israelites are too afraid to kill a priest of God, but a Gentile will do the job. But then David, after having had Saul try to kill him time after time after time, encounters, finds Mephibosheth, who is the grandson of his mortal enemy, and not only a relative of somebody who tried to kill him so many times, but in that culture, if you were descended from a king, you had a shot of being king yourself. And Saul had been king prior to David, and for that reason, his descendants would have an argument that they could make. Look, my family was king before he was, so we have more claim to the kingship. So most any other king would have killed Mephibosheth, or exiled him at least, to get him away because he's a threat. But David takes Mephibosheth and says, "You're going to eat at my table." And so he makes a friend out of an enemy. In the response to their troubles, the climax of this member was Shiloh, and Eli's 2 sons killed in the battle, and Eli falls and breaks his neck after. The climax of this is I forget the site of the battle, but massive Philistine invasion, and they're coming in vast numbers. And what do? Meanwhile, David is in the southern wilderness, and he's been out doing stuff. Or he was going to march into battle on the Philistine side, and the Philistine lords, 4 of them, insist, "David, you can't let David. He's a Hebrew. He's going to turn on us, and so send him back. And so he goes back to his new home in Philistine territory, Ziklag. He gets there, and he finds it's burned to the ground by the Amalekites, whom Saul should have killed. This wouldn't have happened if Saul had obeyed God. The Amalekites have burned down his town, and they took all their wives and children of David and his warriors. And so you have 2 men, and this is both the climax of this big X, and it's another example of David and Saul as foils for each other, because they're at their wit's end. Here's the army, and we're doomed. As Saul, this is, what do we do? How are we going to do this? And then David and his men come to Ziklag, and our wives and children are all gone. Our village is burned down. And then the men say, "This is David's fault. Let's kill him and move on." What to do? So Saul, what does Saul do? He goes to see a witch. Which of course the law forbids. And Saul, in his better days, had actually eliminated most from the land, but there's still one hanging around. And so he goes to see her. David, what does he do? It says he strengthened himself in the Lord. So their response, and those 2 things seem to have happened when you look very carefully at the course of the narrative and the wording. Those 2 things happened apparently on the same day. So on the same day that Saul comes to the end of himself and says, "I'm going to go see a witch and consult the dead," David says, "God is my strength, and I'm going to lean on him." And so Saul and Jonathan die, and then David, very interestingly, does not immediately say, "Well, Saul's dead, now I'm the king." He asks God. From this point, we have a period of time where David patiently waits to become king of all of Israel. And there continues to be trouble with Saul's offspring, which makes the Mephibosheth thing even more surprising. Once David becomes king of all of Israel, a few chapters into 2 Samuel, there's sort of a new narrative that's going to dominate most of 2 Samuel, which is sort of like God's relationship to David, part 1, part 2. Part 1 is God blesses David, and then part 2 is God curses David. The God blesses David is several chapters where not only is he king of a united Israel, but actually begins to acquire an empire, conquering nations all around him, extracting tribute from other nations, and things are going great. And my time's about up, so I got to really hurry. But then comes 2 Samuel 11, and I should say, well, let me bring in. So that thing in 1 Samuel 16 about David is handsome. Is it good for people to be handsome in the Bible? It's kind of a trick question. It's a bit of a potential problem. It's a potential problem anyway. It doesn't have to be a problem, but it could be a problem. And later, as we have the rise of David and fall of Saul, the presentation of all of these characters is very, very nuanced and real life, even gritty at times. And David is not perfect as he's doing his rise. He's not perfect. And one particularly disturbing thing is he takes a second wife and then a third wife. And that's a problem, isn't it? And then later on he takes more. So he seems to have a thing for women. And then we get to 2 Samuel 11, and then comes his major failure, which is David and Bathsheba. And the point of that chapter is not adultery is bad. I mean, we already knew that from the Pentateuch. And it's not even we should be busy. I don't know if you've ever heard like a message, the time when kings go out to war, David stayed home. That's how he fell into sin. So we should be very, what's the takeaway from that chapter? We should all be very busy. That's not exactly it. Not that there's nothing to that, but the David's predilection, we saw it foreshadowed, and for this reason we are not utterly shocked, or we shouldn't be utterly shocked when he falls into sin with Bathsheba. We sort of saw this coming. But here's the thing. David sins as much as or more than Saul did. And what happened with Saul when he sinned? The kingdom was taken away from him. But what's going to happen with David when he sins? Well, the kingdom is not taken away from him. And ultimately, this is God's grace and God's faithfulness to his promise. There's also a difference, once again, the foil, David and Saul. When Saul is confronted with his sin, he makes excuses. When David is confronted with his sin, he says, I have sinned.
He writes scripture.
And he accepts the consequences. And he prays for mercy, but he knows that God is in charge. So the response of David and Saul, and there is I think one of the big lessons is God uses people who repent. God doesn't use only people who have never sinned, else none of us would be used by God, for we all sin. But God uses repentant sinners. Saul was not repentant, David was. But the consequences of David's sin come upon him. And most of the rest of 2 Samuel is curses upon David. In this role of first receiving God's blessing and then receiving God's curse, David represents the nation of Israel. There is a lot in common with David the man and Israel the nation. For example, Israel, because of its sin, would one day have to go in exile to the east, to Babylon. David, because of his sin, would have to go into exile from Jerusalem east of the Jordan River when he fled from Absalom. This is a lot right here, but let me just kind of dump this on you. David is a representation. He's a new Abraham. He's Israel as a man. Listen to some of these things. In the Pentateuch, we repeatedly have barren women bearing children. The book of Samuel starts with a barren woman who bears a son who is going to anoint David. The major figures in Genesis and the Pentateuch, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the children, Judah, and then Moses are shepherds. David is a shepherd. Moses uses a shepherd's implement to cross the Red Sea and make the Nile blood and so on. David uses a shepherd's instrument to kill Goliath. Even like, why do you come to me with sticks? It's probably the shepherd's rod that he's carrying with him. The patriarchs had trouble with, but then sometimes weirdly sought the protection of Philistine rulers in their day. David did exactly the same thing. He had a lot of trouble with Philistines, but he also asked for their help on one major occasion, or two occasions. David and Abraham are the only ones whose names God says he will make great in the Old Testament. Genesis 2:12 and 2 Samuel 7:9. Adam, Cain, David, and later Israel all go for their sin into exile in the east. David as a younger sibling chosen over the older, like Jacob, like Judah, and so on. In the blessing portion of this comes the promise of God that David's line, every member will have the privilege, not the right, but the privilege to sit on the throne of Israel as they walk in righteousness. And this makes David's dynasty an eternal dynasty and sets the stage for one day one of his descendants being on the throne forever, because he will always be righteous. And this, of course, is Jesus Christ according to the flesh. So 2 Samuel 7 is in some ways the brightest part of the whole book of Samuel, and it's one of the key stepping stones of the entire Bible. It's like research. Hopefully some of these things will help you to read the book of Samuel for fresh eyes, and reading it for yourself is the main thing. There's some good study Bibles on this, and so of course words of men, so always take it with a grain of salt, just like me talking to you. But the ESV study Bible is very helpful when it comes to literary things like this, story of the Bible type stuff. There's a commentary series called Teach the Text, and several of you are ladies, but in helping people learn how to teach the text, this helps you to learn the text. So even if you don't turn around and preach it, which I think you shouldn't as ladies, still this book. So there's a Teach the Text series, and the book on 1 Samuel is very helpful. In the top right panel on a lot of pages is a neat thing, which is in literally one or two sentences. It'll say, what is this chapter about? And that it's almost worth the price of the book, just for these little couple sentences, to take this whole chapter and boil it down to what is this about. If you want to dig deeper, the New American Commentary series, there's a whole set for the whole Bible, the New American Commentary series, and the volume on 1st and 2nd Samuel by Robert Burgeon, Bergen. Robert Burgeon in the New American Commentary series, his volume on 1st and 2nd Samuel is superb. I've learned so much from his work on this book. So clearly a lot more we could say, but hopefully this has been helpful.